Ida for telling my coworker he should teach his daughter tact? Working in an office, surrounded by the constant rhythm of daily tasks and interpersonal interactions, can create an atmosphere that feels more intimate than it is. For the past several years, I've shared this space with Ken, a man in his 40s who exudes a quiet confidence and a steadfast dedication to his work. Our camaraderie had been natural from the start, blossoming into a friendly rapport that I mistakenly allowed to take root as something more. Over the last year, I had tried, in my own subtle but obvious way, to open the door to a romantic possibility. It wasn't desperation or naivety driving me but rather a genuine curiosity and admiration for a man who seemed so steadfast and composed. Ken, however, remained unresponsive to my cues. His calm demeanor never wavered, and I attributed his lack of reciprocation to cluelessness rather than rejection. I told myself it wasn't a reflection of me, convincing myself that his focus was elsewhere or that perhaps he simply hadn't noticed. I persisted in my subtle gestures and extra coffee on his desk, casual invitations to lunch, and lighthearted jokes that lingered on the edge of flirtation. But week after week, my hints fell into silence, like pebbles dropped into a still pond, leaving only faint ripples that quickly disappeared. Then came the day Esme, his 15-year-old daughter, and Ken's father stopped by the office. It was a quiet Tuesday, one of those days that feels like it's suspended between the chaos of Monday and the anticipation of the weekend. They arrived just before lunch, carrying a carefully packed meal for Ken. Their visit was a welcome distraction. Esme had a charming politeness about her, the kind of poised self-awareness that belied her age. Ken's father, a man of few words but warm smiles, exuded a paternal pride as he watched his granddaughter navigate the unfamiliar environment of an office with ease. As they exchanged pleasantries with the staff, I felt a pang of envy at the familial connection they shared. Esme, though young, carried herself with a sharp wit and confidence that hinted at the influence of a father who had clearly invested deeply in her upbringing. I tried to engage with her briefly, exchanging pleasantries, but she remained cordial yet distant, her polite smile never quite reaching her eyes. After about 30 minutes, they prepared to leave, and I saw my usual opportunity to invite Ken to lunch. It was our unspoken routine. Most days, I'd ask, and depending on his workload or mood, he'd either accept or decline. It was a harmless ritual, one that I clung to as a thin thread connecting us beyond the boundaries of work. Today was no different, or so I thought. I approached his desk, my tone light and teasing as I asked if he wanted to join me. Ken, as usual, gave a measured no, his voice carrying no hint of annoyance or reluctance. But for reasons I couldn't explain, I pushed a little further, adding a playful, "Are you sure you're sure?" It was meant to be harmless, just a nudge to see if he might change his mind. Before Ken could respond, Esme's voice cut through the moment like a shard of glass. "He said he's sure." Her words were sharp, decisive, and left no room for ambiguity. The air seemed to shift, tension creeping into the space as Ken and his father exchanged startled glances. My smile faltered, but I pressed on, muttering a light-hearted acknowledgement, hoping to diffuse the awkwardness. Yet Esme wasn't finished. Her next words landed like a hammer blow, each syllable carrying the weight of her disapproval. "Take a hint," she said, her tone laced with impatience and a startling authority for someone so young. Ken finally interjected, his voice firm but calm as he told her to stop. But the damage was done. She turned to him, her expression unwavering as she delivered the final blow. "It's not my fault she doesn't understand at her big age." In that moment, the awkwardness solidified into something tangible, a weight pressing down on my chest. I felt exposed, like a child caught in a game they didn't know they were playing. No one spoke. Ken's father avoided my gaze, and Ken's expression was unreadable, a careful mask that revealed nothing of what he might be feeling. I mumbled an excuse and retreated to the break room, my appetite replaced by a gnawing sense of humiliation. The incident replayed in my mind as I sat there, the harshness of Esme's words echoing like a taunt. Her confidence, so striking at first, now felt like a blade turned against me. I wanted to believe that her outburst was nothing more than a teenager's impulsiveness, but the clarity and intent in her voice suggested otherwise. It wasn't just a moment of brashness, it was a deliberate statement, one that left no doubt about where I stood in her world or Ken's. In the quiet solitude of the break room, I allowed myself to cry, the tears a mix of frustration, embarrassment, and the sting of rejection I'd tried so hard to avoid acknowledging. I told myself it didn't matter, that Ken's disinterest wasn't personal, and that Esme's words were the product of her youthful arrogance. But deep down, I knew it was more complicated than that. I had misjudged the boundaries of our relationship, blinded by my own desires, and now I was paying the price. For days, I avoided Ken. The memory of Esme's words burned like an open wound, and I couldn't bring myself to face him, even for the sake of maintaining our workplace harmony. I buried myself in tasks, kept my head down during meetings, and skipped the usual casual interactions. It was easier to hide than to confront the growing discomfort that hung in the air like a storm cloud. Yet the longer I avoided him, the heavier the weight of unresolved tension became. Time passed, and the initial sting of embarrassment began to dull. But in its place grew a gnawing unease, a feeling that something fundamental between us had shifted. It wasn't just about Esme's harsh words, it was about my role in creating the situation. I had to acknowledge the truth. I had crossed an unspoken boundary, pursuing something that Ken had never invited. I owed him an apology, and more importantly, I needed closure for my own sake. It took me weeks to gather the courage, but I finally decided to talk to him. One afternoon, when the office was quieter than usual, I approached his desk. My voice was steady, but my heart raced as I asked if we could talk privately. Ken looked up from his computer, his expression calm and unreadable, and nodded. We found an empty conference room, and as soon as the door closed, I felt the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. I started with an apology. I told him I regretted making him uncomfortable, that my actions had been thoughtless and rooted in my own assumptions. Ken listened without interrupting, his arms crossed loosely, his gaze steady but not unkind. When I finished, he sighed softly and, to my surprise, apologized in return. He admitted that he should have been more direct with me from the beginning. He explained that he'd noticed my interest but had hoped it would pass without confrontation. He didn't want to hurt my feelings, but his inaction had only made things worse. Then, for the first time, he opened up about himself. Ken hadn't dated since his divorce 11 years ago, a revelation that stunned me. I'd known he was private, but this level of detachment was unexpected. He described how his divorce had left him disillusioned with relationships. He had thrown himself into raising Esme and rebuilding his life, finding solace in routine and simplicity. Over time, he realized he didn't miss companionship the way others might. He described his life as happily uninvolved, a term that initially confused me until he clarified. He had chosen complete celibacy, not just abstinence from romantic relationships but from the entire concept of dating or intimacy. It was a perspective I hadn't encountered before, and it took me a moment to process. In a world that often seemed obsessed with romance and connection, Ken's contentment with solitude was both foreign and fascinating. I couldn't help but respect the conviction it must have taken to maintain such a lifestyle, especially in the face of societal expectations. Ken was honest but not unkind. He acknowledged my feelings, stating plainly that he appreciated me as a coworker and a friend but didn't share my romantic interest. He reiterated that his life was fulfilling as it was, and he didn't see that changing anytime soon if ever. It was a lot to take in, but the conversation, though difficult, felt necessary. We ended on what felt like solid ground. There were no lingering accusations, no unspoken grievances. It was an adult conversation, grounded in mutual respect. I walked away with a sense of closure, even if it wasn't the outcome I had once hoped for. Yet, as much as the conversation brought clarity, it also left me grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. There was relief in knowing where I stood and a newfound understanding of Ken's perspective. But there was also an undeniable sting of rejection, compounded by the humiliation I still felt over Esme's comments. And while Ken's apology for his daughter's behavior was sincere, it didn't erase the lingering ache of that encounter. The days following our talk were a mixed bag. On the surface, things seemed to return to normal. Ken and I maintained a cordial working relationship, and the awkwardness began to dissipate. But beneath the surface, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked in the eyes of our co-workers. The cold shoulders I received from a few colleagues hinted at conversations I hadn't been privy to, at judgments passed behind closed doors. Finally, curiosity or perhaps desperation got the better of me. I confided in a friend at the office, someone I trusted to be honest. When I asked what was going on, her hesitant response confirmed my fears. Some people felt I had overstepped by confronting Ken about Esme's behavior. They saw it as an attack on his parenting, an unfair critique of a man who had dedicated his life to raising his daughter. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. In my attempt to advocate for myself, I had unwittingly become the villain in a story I didn't even know was being written. The perception stung more than I cared to admit. I had always prided myself on being empathetic and understanding, but now I was being painted as someone who lacked tact and respect. I tried to let it go, to focus on my work and remind myself that opinions fade with time. But the nagging ache in my stomach refused to disappear. I replayed the events over and over in my mind, questioning every word I had said, every choice I had made. Had I been wrong to stand up for myself? Should I have let the incident with Esme slide, chalking it up to teenage impulsiveness? Or was I justified in seeking accountability, even if it meant upsetting the delicate balance of workplace dynamics? In the quiet moments of self-reflection, I began to see the situation in a new light. Perhaps the real issue wasn't about who was right or wrong but about the deeper insecurities and vulnerabilities that had been exposed. My pursuit of Ken had been rooted in my own longing for connection, a desire to find meaning in a relationship that ultimately wasn't meant to be. Esme's harshness, though painful, was a reflection of her fierce loyalty to her father, a quality I might have admired under different circumstances. And Ken? He was simply a man trying to navigate life on his own terms, raising a daughter who clearly adored him and guarding his peace with unwavering resolve. It was a kind of strength I couldn't fault, even if it had come at the cost of my own feelings. As the days turned into weeks, I began to focus on moving forward. The sting of rejection and the discomfort of office gossip would linger for a while, but I knew they would fade with time. More importantly, I resolved to learn from the experience to approach future relationships with a greater awareness of boundaries and a deeper respect for the choices and perspectives of others. In the end, life continued as it always does. The office buzzed with its usual rhythm, the dramas of one week giving way to the concerns of the next. And while the memory of my missteps would remain, it was tempered by the lessons I had gained. For better or worse, the chapter with Ken had closed, leaving me to turn the page and face whatever came next with a renewed sense of self-awareness. As I walked away from that conversation with Ken, a weight settled in my chest. The exchange had started with a semblance of closure, but now it felt like I had inadvertently opened a wound I hadn't realized was there. My intentions had been clear. I wanted to understand, to make sense of the sting of Esme's words and the discomfort they had caused. But somehow, my words had struck a nerve in Ken, shifting the dynamic between us into unfamiliar, unsettling territory. I replayed the conversation in my mind, analyzing every word, every nuance of his reaction. When I questioned Esme's behavior and suggested that she could have handled the situation with more tact, I hadn't anticipated how fiercely protective Ken would become. His daughter was his pride, his proof that he had succeeded in a role he valued above all else. My critique, however well-intentioned, had touched the foundation of his identity as a single father. I hadn't meant to offend him, and I had apologized immediately, but the damage was done. His abrupt end to the conversation left no room for resolution. In the days that followed, the air between us was noticeably colder. The easy camaraderie we had once shared was replaced with strained silence. Ken, always professional, treated me with polite detachment, but the warmth was gone. It was like we had become strangers, tethered only by the necessity of working together. I tried to maintain an air of normalcy, but every interaction felt heavy with unspoken tension. I couldn't help but wonder if my insistence on discussing Esme's behavior had been a mistake, if I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The shift in Ken's demeanor wasn't the only change. Subtle but undeniable, a ripple effect seemed to move through the office. Colleagues who had once greeted me with smiles now offered clipped nods, their conversations growing quieter when I entered the room. It was as if an invisible wall had risen around me, isolating me from the easy rhythm of office life. I suspected that Ken had shared some version of our conversation with others, though whether intentionally or in passing, I couldn't be sure. Whatever the case, the result was clear: I was being judged, and the verdict was not in my favor. I tried to push through the unease, to focus on my work and let time smooth over the rough edges. But the isolation weighed on me. Every cold glance, every whispered conversation that stopped as I approached, chipped away at my confidence. I began to doubt myself, to question whether I had been wrong to speak up. Was I being unreasonable? Had I overstepped in questioning how Ken raised his daughter? The guilt gnawed at me, its claws digging deeper with each passing day. Despite my efforts to ignore it, the situation refused to fade into the background. One afternoon, a colleague I trusted pulled me aside, her expression cautious but concerned. "I think you should know," she began hesitantly. "Some people think you were out of line with Ken." Her words confirmed what I had already suspected, but hearing them aloud felt like a punch to the gut. She explained that my comments about Esme had been interpreted as a critique of Ken's parenting, something that many viewed as deeply personal and inappropriate. I thanked her for her honesty, but inside, I was reeling. It was never my intention to question Ken's abilities as a father. My frustration had been with the way I was treated, the lack of empathy in Esme's words. But somewhere along the way, my message had been lost, twisted into something I hadn't meant. The misunderstanding was maddening, but what stung most was the realization that I was powerless to change it. The damage was done, and no amount of explanation could erase the perception that had taken root. In my moments of solitude, I wrestled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, I stood by my belief that Esme's words had been unnecessarily harsh and that she could have shown more kindness. On the other hand, I couldn't ignore the reality of Ken's perspective. His world revolved around his daughter, and his pride in her was undeniable. To him, my words likely felt like an attack on something sacred. The realization brought a mix of guilt and sadness, a sense of regret for the unintended hurt I had caused. As the days turned into weeks, I began to notice subtle shifts in my own perspective. What had started as a quest for validation and closure evolved into a deeper understanding of the complexities of human relationships. Ken's protectiveness over Esme wasn't just about her, it was about the life they had built together, the choices he had made, and the values he held dear. My own feelings of rejection, though valid, paled in comparison to the depth of his connection with his daughter. In an effort to move forward, I focused on self-reflection. I acknowledged my mistakes, the assumptions I had made, and the boundaries I had overlooked. But I also reminded myself of my worth, refusing to let the judgment of others define me. The road to rebuilding my confidence was not easy, but it was necessary. I leaned on my trusted friends outside of work, seeking solace in their unwavering support. As for Ken, our interactions remained professional but distant. The warmth we had once shared never returned, and I came to accept that it likely never would. It was a bittersweet realization, a reminder that not every connection is meant to last. But in letting go of what once was, I found a sense of peace. I learned to forgive myself, to release the burden of regret, and to focus on the lessons the experience had taught me. The incident with Esme, painful as it had been, became a turning point in my journey of self-discovery. It taught me the importance of empathy, not just for others but for myself. It reminded me that people's choices and behaviors are often shaped by experiences I may never fully understand. And above all, it reinforced the value of boundaries, both in respecting them and in setting them for myself. Life at the office eventually settled into a new normal. The whispers faded, the cold shoulders thawed, and the rhythm of work resumed. I carried the scars of the experience, but they no longer felt like wounds. They were reminders of growth, of resilience, and of the strength it takes to navigate the messy, beautiful complexity of human relationships. And with each passing day, I moved closer to a future that was not defined by the past but shaped by the lessons it had left behind. The nagging ache in my stomach refused to subside, gnawing at me like a constant reminder of the unresolved tension. Despite my efforts to move forward, the sense of alienation at work clung to me, its weight heavier with each passing day. My friend's revelation that people thought I was wrong to have said what I did to Ken stayed at the forefront of my mind. I tried to convince myself to let it go, to chalk it up to a misunderstanding and focus on my own path. But the thoughts kept looping in my head. Was I wrong? Should I have stayed silent? Was my frustration unjustified? The need for reassurance began to consume me. I started overanalyzing every interaction at work, replaying conversations in my mind, searching for clues in the expressions and tones of my coworkers. I hated how much it mattered to me, how deeply the situation had burrowed into my psyche. I began to feel trapped by the judgments of others, trapped by my own overthinking, and most of all, trapped by the lingering sting of rejection that I hadn't fully acknowledged. One evening, after yet another day of strained interactions and cold shoulders, I decided I couldn't keep carrying the weight alone. I reached out to a therapist, someone who could offer an objective perspective and help me untangle the mess of emotions that had taken root. It felt like a small but significant step away to reclaim control over a situation that had left me feeling powerless. In our first session, I laid it all out, my feelings for Ken, my awkward attempts at connection, Esme's harsh words, and the fallout that had followed. My therapist listened intently, her expression kind but neutral, and when I finished, she asked a simple but profound question: what are you hoping to gain by revisiting this situation? The question stopped me in my tracks. What was I hoping to gain? At first, I struggled to articulate it. I wanted validation, perhaps, or an acknowledgement that my feelings and frustrations were justified. But as I delved deeper, I realized it wasn't just about being right. What I truly wanted was closure, not from Ken or Esme or my coworkers, but from myself. I needed to let go of the need for others to understand or validate my experience and instead find peace within myself. Over the next few weeks, I worked on reframing my perspective. I began to see the situation not as a personal failure but as a learning experience. I acknowledged my mistakes, pushing too hard, misreading signals, and letting my emotions cloud my judgment, but I also recognized the courage it took to confront those mistakes and grow from them. My therapist helped me see that seeking reassurance from others was a natural response but not always a productive one. True closure, she reminded me, could only come from within. Meanwhile, life at work continued. The cold shoulders persisted for a time, but gradually, the office's attention shifted to other matters. New projects emerged, new dramas unfolded, and my misstep with Ken became just another forgotten story in the ever-changing landscape of workplace dynamics. The relief was palpable, but it didn't erase the lessons I had learned. I knew that the experience had left its mark on me, shaping how I would approach relationships and conflicts in the future. Ken and I maintained a polite but distant relationship. We exchanged pleasantries when necessary, collaborated on work tasks without issue, but the warmth and camaraderie we once shared were gone. It was a loss I had to accept, even as it left a lingering sadness. I came to understand that some relationships are meant to be temporary, their purpose fulfilled in ways we might not fully understand until much later. As for Esme, I never interacted with her again. But over time, I began to see her actions through a more empathetic lens. She was a young girl fiercely protective of her father, navigating the complexities of adolescence while watching him shield himself from the world. Her words, though hurtful, were a reflection of that loyalty, not an attack on me as a person. In a way, I could almost admire the strength she showed in standing her ground, even if I disagreed with how she expressed it. Months passed, and the ache that had once consumed me began to fade. I focused on building a stronger sense of self, investing in friendships outside of work, and pursuing hobbies that brought me joy. I took steps to rebuild my confidence, reminding myself of my worth and refusing to let a single incident define me. The experience with Ken and Esme became a chapter in my story, one filled with mistakes and misunderstandings. Yes, but also with growth and resilience. Looking back, I realized that what had started as a pursuit of romance had transformed into something far more meaningful. It had forced me to confront my vulnerabilities, to navigate rejection with grace, and to find strength in the face of judgment. It had taught me the importance of boundaries, not just respecting those of others, but also setting and protecting my own. And perhaps most importantly, it had shown me that self-worth doesn't come from the approval of others but from the quiet, steadfast belief in my own value. By the time the 1-year mark of the incident rolled around, I had reached a place of peace. The lingering pain and embarrassment were replaced by a sense of gratitude for the lessons learned. I no longer felt the need to seek reassurance from others. Instead, I carried the quiet confidence of someone who had faced a difficult experience and come out stronger on the other side. In the end, the story wasn't about Ken or Esme or the judgment of my coworkers. It was about me, about learning to navigate the complexities of human connection, about embracing imperfection, and about finding closure not in the validation of others but in the strength I found within myself. And with that realization, I turned the page, ready to write the next chapter of my life with clarity, resilience, and hope.